Okay. Well, I guess first of all, I don't know if people who are on the webinar can speak or anything, but the question I have is, was anyone present at the original talk we did? Because we're going to walk over some of the same ground today. We're talking primarily about what cybersecurity assessments are, and to some extent what they are not. So, is this like a whole new audience today, or where are we at?
I was not part of the earlier session.
Okay, great. Well, so the background is I work for Schneider Electric, and we're a large provider of a lot of um, energy-oriented energy management, power control. There's a million different arms to our company, a very large, comprehensive solution company. But one thing that developed out of our company over the last 20 years was the need for, especially in critical infrastructure spaces, cybersecurity programs, plans, and of course, this leads to assessments. So how do you find out what you have? So one of the things we like to start with when we are talking about this cybersecurity assessments is what we call our OT, cybersecurity maturity model, right? And this goes for a lot of clients know they need to do something about cybersecurity. The difference between what they're doing on the IT side versus the OT side. And I'm hoping most people on the call know this, because we don't quite have enough time to go through all the details. But the core idea is that your IT stuff tends to land in your enterprise networks, everything that handles all your spreadsheets, banking type information, data, organizational data. When you're looking at the way that the model is looked at as far as what's called the Purdue model, there are layers in which once you go down certain levels, you start talking about the operational technology. So when you hear people throw around the word OT, that's what they're referring to, is sort of the stuff in the lower level assets, often stuff that people don't talk about as much, like power control, BMSs, process control. Some clients, say like oil and gas clients, have really extensive refinery processes that are highly sensitive and have to be protected and managed. When you're a lot of life sciences or consumer packaged goods companies have really complicated process networks. So this is what's considered in the OT world. And unfortunately, due to just the way corporations and companies have developed over the years, things in the OT space tend to not get quite the same attention as IT has over the years, except for the people who have to be responsible for them. So I'm sure there are a lot of people on this call who are responsible for the OT cyber on their organization, and probably are quite perhaps rightfully anxious about how can they, what do they need to do to become a better cyber secure organization. So where we talk about it is step one, and don't feel bad if this is where your organization is. About 60% of organizations are at or before this step, is gaining awareness. As they say, the first step to solving any problem is admitting that you have one, and recognizing and committing to the need to address your OT security. This is where you get to the point where perhaps you develop either the funding or the internal resources to follow through and actually do assessments. And now that's what we'll talk about that more in a minute, what is entailed. But step two is when you start saying, okay, I want to gain some visibility into my OT network. What assets are talking on my network? How is my network laid out? How secure is it? Does it follow design principles that will keep my organization secure and my process networks, my operational technology networks secure? So at this point, when we engage with a client, we have many larger sort of what we would call portfolio clients that have a large, say, global footprint, 40, 50, 100, 200 sites globally. We ourselves as a company have about the same kind of footprint. We manufacture a lot of goods. So as they say, we drink our own champagne. But getting this visibility, doing an asset or a cybersecurity assessment is where that can be done, and I'll explain more how it's done, what standards are used. But when that's complete, you end up with a list of high risk, high cost, all the way down to low risk, low cost, any permutation of those. And you find out that's usually what we call the oh wow moment. It's where you actually have visibility into what risks, blind spots, what governance gaps. And this is where, a lot of organizations, you'll hear in cybersecurity when they talk about it, there's three main pillars: people, process, and technology. And sometimes the blind spots you have is that you may have done everything right from a process. You may have the best processes in the world and the best technology, but your people just don't know not to click on phishing links, right? And they can compromise certain parts of your enterprise network at that point. Perhaps your technology isn't deployed in the right way, so you don't actually have the protection you thought you had between the enterprise network and the operational technology network. So there can be situations where a compromising of the enterprise network, which is the network that's the closest to the internet connection, where compromising can happen, if there isn't a proper delineation, or what we call a DMZ, demilitarized zone, between the two systems, someone who compromises your enterprise network can compromise your OT network. So this is where phishing scams and ransomware, it's a bigger topic. We're not going to talk about that today, but this is where, when you get that results from your cybersecurity assessment, that's where you find out really how far you have to go. Step 4, and again, step through 4, this is another 30%. So once we get to step 4, we're talking about 90% of organizations are still in these phases. Once you get to knowing what the problems are and what you need to fix, that's where we get to firefighting, right? You're prioritizing and addressing your top blind spots. You're looking at the overall risk to your company, the costs, potential costs, the downtime, and then you're trying to fill in those governance gaps. Who's responsible for patching the OT systems that you have? Let's say you have maybe people don't know, but PLCs stand for programmable logic controllers. These are devices that have been around for 40, 50 years that essentially are programmable and can manage your process line. Well, if they get compromised, what kind of downstream effects do you have? What kind of backup plans do you have? If there were a full ransomware attack, could you not pay the ransom and get your system back up and running within 24 hours or within 48 hours? Or would you be in a position where you might have to pay the ransom? Things like that. And once we get past this firefighting phase, that's when it's like a lot of things in our lives. Once you have done enough of the original work, then you start moving into the high maturity level in that area. So with OT, getting to step 5 here is when you're talking about integration. And now integration refers to basically combining your IT and your OT infrastructure in a way that they're actually cooperative and the people are friends. Now, probably a lot of people on this call might be either smirking a little or laughing a little, because we all know that OT teams and IT teams don't always get along. And there's very good reasons for that, historical and otherwise, why the people who manage the process networks often don't see fully eye to eye with the folks who manage the enterprise networks. But when you get to a point where you have high maturity from a cybersecurity posture, everyone's pulling the horses in the same direction. There's often what's called like a SOC, a Security Operations Center, that is in the IT layer, that will allow people to allow the right IT folks that are to be operationally focused and see about threats in their operational network in a way that does not impact the operation of the OT network. So this is where you have a strong governance program. You've got great tools. Step 6, almost nobody gets here. It's a lofty goal to be in the point where you're completely optimized. You've harnessed your OT security capabilities, and your organization is completely resilient. No matter what gets thrown at you, what kind of cybersecurity attacks or otherwise, or accidental, unintentional employee actions, you are in a position where your organization essentially is unstoppable. So what is the goal of a cybersecurity assessment on an OT network? Well, the key thing that's different between OT and IT is that you have quite a mixture of legacy systems and newer systems and different vendors. And you need to be able to one of the reasons why IT and OT don't get along at times is because at some point someone in IT ran an IT type cybersecurity scanning tool on the OT network and took out the process line. And that's where, it comes down to governance. How could you run that on my OT network? Did you not realize that kind of stuff? So the keywords here are non-invasive. There are ways to do asset discovery and software. I won't go too deeply into it, but we partner with several companies, but one of our main partners is a company called Clarity, and they have an excellent tool called Edge that we use that helps us really basically the tool knows how to speak the language of the devices, of all these OT devices, and it knows how to, in a non-invasive way, query them, find out what their firmware revision is, what their model number is, and from there we can determine what kind of vulnerabilities and risks happen. If, let's say, you have a set of PLCs that just haven't been patched for 15 years for some reason since it was brand new, there's likely a lot of vulnerabilities there that can be patched, right? So things like that. And it should provide a really high level view of basically the customer's cyber posture or stance, and help them figure out what they need to do next to get to industry best practices, right? And the standard we lead with when we're talking about industrial environments tends to be IEC 62443. On the IT side, there are standards called NIST 800, and it's a very wide variety of standards that have to do with basically IT cyber. 800-82 was their sort of that group's attempt to sort of focus on operational technology to some extent, and it is comprehensive, but it does sort of look at it from the lens of the IT world just a little bit more than, say, IEC 62443 is definitely the industrial standard we work with. There's NERC-CIP, which several people who work with Aviva Select are concerned with this. We chatted with several people at the conference a couple weeks back. These are more higher level standards that are often affect utilities, and there are ways to protect. A lot of nuclear plants have to do this. There are a lot of I think water and power that have to work with NERC-CIP. I won't go into all the other ones, but there are a lot of different standards. The top three are the top three we have on this list. So what are the things that the assessors try to conduct what we call controls related network discussions? So what is ICS? Stands for Industrial Control System. What is your network architecture? Are you employing design principles such as defense in depth? Defense in depth is the idea that you want to make it so that anyone who manages to get into your enterprise network has to basically get around the security provided at each layer, and that your most critical assets are in a position where they are defended because the person has to go through many levels. The analogy that gets used a lot is it's kind of like if you had your crown jewels in your kingdom and you put them right by the front door and there wasn't a lock on the front door. Well, that's what a lot of network architectures, unfortunately, when they're super flat and they're not protected, or let's say they're connected for remote access but not in a secure way, that's the kind of stuff that we're looking at, right? What are the ICS components? What are in your industrial control systems? What are the components you have? What are the assets? What are your procedures and policies? Who's responsible for making sure that cybersecurity is upfront and center when you're doing any projects, any changes, without it becoming so onerous that nobody can do anything, right? So there's a balance to be had there. Who is responsible for patching, right? When a contractor leaves the company, who's responsible for removing their credentials from the remote access tool? Things like that. Do you have a good secure remote access solution? Obviously, we also we have Clarity provides, and a number of other vendors provide a great secure remote access tool that will allow you to really get granularity and view and even record sessions of people who connect or not. There are a lot of older style remote access tools that were pretty good for their time in the mid 2000s and maybe even early 2010s, but that are just not going to do well up against the type of cyber attack tools that exist now. Obviously, we're going to look at your physical security procedures as well. The old school method to protect OT networks was always what they call air gapping, which just basically means not on the same network. There's no way to get to it. It's physically protected in a room. And for a long time, that was how people felt like, well, you know what, we don't have to worry about cyber for that because we've got it protected. We've got cameras, we've got a security guard. You know, and you know, we've all seen the movies where someone's trying to infiltrate, you know, some secure base and is trying to get around those type of controls. The problem is with this IT OT convergence, there are a lot of devices that now need an internet connection or some kind of connection to an enterprise network. They're building management systems that provide data up to a larger system in the enterprise network. So I can think of many different software tools and SCADAs that collect stuff locally and then need to provide stuff to a larger sort of dashboard view for the executives and for company members. And that's where figuring out the difference between your physical security and your cybersecurity is fundamental, right? So the next thing is like, what level of training has been provided for your personnel? Do they understand what they have to do cyber-wise? Is there a way to document an incident when an incident happens? What are your procedures? Is that documented? What is the disaster recovery plan? What kind of life cycle management policy? Meaning, when you have an end of life device, you know, we worked with clients that kind of, you know, your hair stands up on end when you find out that the firewall they've been using, the main firewall they've been using isn't configured correctly. It's mainly passing information through. Firewalls need a lot of configuration to be set up correctly. And, you know, sometimes you find out that device has been end of life for a decade. And that's going to be a highly risky point in your network design. So, and finally, you know, like role-based security practices. What roles are assigned to whom? Who's responsible for your cybersecurity? So let's talk about like use cases for a cybersecurity assessment. Kind of what we mentioned to begin with: IT, IoT, OT, asset discovery. Right, getting visibility in everything that's on your network. We say managed and unmanaged assets. We want to have the strongest foundation to build your program on. We need to know what you have, right? It said lifecycle and vulnerability management. What are there's a thing that you probably heard people talk about called zero-day events, and that's when there's a vulnerability discovered in a device that is often has been in the device since it was new, or a particular version since it was released. And once it's out there in the world at large, you need to patch immediately. Every day that you don't patch it is another day that you're taking a big risk because it's published, it's known, it's a risk, right? So trying to figure out, as I mentioned, end of life for devices, get your head wrapped around when you might need to do a modernization project for certain parts of your process network. And then finding out what's no longer supported, right? There are some devices that are out in the field that were designed incredibly well in the 80s and still work, but are effectively a cybersecurity risk for you. Audit and compliance, again, you know, how do you be in a position where you can support audit requests? If there's a compliance, NERC one of the good examples that we talked about earlier. There are requirements for, depending on the size of your utility. And if you were to be in a position where the scope and size of your utility had shifted or changed since your original designation, there can be very significant fines. So how do you have a program that puts you in a position where, when asked, when questioned, when audited, you have answers, and the right answers that don't result in these potentially $1 million of fines? You might also want to do a cybersecurity assessment. You know, an analogy could be made: when you buy a home, you often make sure to get a home inspection. If you're gonna merge with another company or acquire another company, you would do well to have a very clear idea of what exactly is in that industrial network. They can tell you they have a really advanced, great process line, but until you really get a good look at it, you probably find out really quickly if you're trying to acquire a company and you put in the terms that a cybersecurity assessment was required. If they quickly got awkward and tried to change the topic and didn't want that included, probably a pretty good clue that perhaps there's a lot of risk in that industrial control network. And of course, incident response, right? You want to be in a position where when something happens, you can wrap your arms around the issue. You don't end up in a situation where there's just mass confusion. And when a cyber attack can happen, that's sort of what they're relying on. There's ways to mitigate and stop and slow down an attack, but you want to be in a position where if you really know how your network's set up, you can make better decisions. You can isolate devices. You can find out what happened before it spreads throughout your network. One of the key things is forensics. There are great tools for you to be able to forensically find out what happened and make sure it never happens again. But also, from an insurance standpoint, sometimes those forensics will be extremely useful. So when you're done with a cybersecurity assessment, you end up with, in our reports anyway, we make sure to provide, essentially, like I said, from low to critical, right? And a low level issue is something like we say, and I'll mostly read off the page here so that I make it clear. But vulnerabilities are non-exploitable, but would reduce an organization's attack surface. So this idea of an attack surface is how many points and how many ways can you have your system exploited and damaged. The smaller you can make that attack surface, obviously, the less likely you are to be attacked, right? But this is one where it'd be more about, here's a plan of action, patch the next time you have a maintenance window. Something in the moderate zone, yes, you have vulnerabilities. They're not exploitable or require quite a few steps, like social engineering to get passwords and all that stuff. This is where we'd say, you need a plan of action here. You got to patch after, basically the high priority issues have been resolved. This is like moderate, right? High priority meaning the next couple we're going to talk about. Something important would be like exploitation is more difficult, but could cause elevated privileges and potentially a loss of data or downtime. Basically a plan of action and patch as soon as possible. And when we get to critical, this is something where the exploitation is actually pretty easy, results in system level compromise. And it's basically, this needs to be dealt with immediately as soon as possible, right? Obviously, vulnerabilities come in different sizes when it comes to financial impact. There are many vulnerabilities that will tell you, if you're lucky, there's some high risk, low cost things or critical things that are low cost to fix. Those are obviously a client's favorite. You can get those sorted fast, but there are going to be likely some critical issues that require significant investment, and that's where it becomes a business decision. Sometimes some companies decide to just increase their insurance. Insurance is a tricky game because it's such an evolving landscape. You need to really know what you're talking about to make sure that the right terms and conditions are set up on your policy. And I think there's a stat that's something like 50 some odd percent of insurance claims, maybe it's a little less than that, people have found that they weren't covered quite in the way that they hoped they would be, which we're all familiar from car insurance situations where you try to claim something and find out, well, it turns out that, in the fine print, that's not really covered. So what questions to ask yourself? Do you know all of the assets connected to your OT network? Within your company, if you're responsible for the long-term viability of your process lines or your operational technology network, do you know what's talking on your network? Are there procedures for when people add and remove devices? Is there any tracking of what's happening there, right? Can you tell me what your riskiest vulnerabilities are right now? Do you know what those are? If you have a clear picture of the risk versus reward, the insurance conversation we talked about, you've already done that work, maybe that's just fine. But if you don't know what your riskiest vulnerabilities are, an assessment is a way to get your answers quicker, kind of find out how bad the problem could be. Maybe you're lucky, maybe you've had really great engineers along the way who have made sure that cybersecurity was considered in every migration, every upgrade, every mitigation project. And we have found sites like that. They're just exceedingly rare because often just organizationally, the way networks happen and staff turnover and all that stuff, often there's not a clear picture of who exactly is responsible for cybersecurity, right? So, asking when was the last time we even did a cybersecurity assessment? Unfortunately, because cybersecurity is such a high anxiety, high risk item, there are a lot of companies that, a little bit like when Y2K happened, there were a lot of contractors who did amazing work to help mitigate a very serious issue. But there were also a lot of contractors who smelled money and found a way to talk about it where they would say, we'll do a cybersecurity assessment for you. They may not have the experience in the operational technology world, which is fundamentally very different mindset wise. And the tools required to get a great list of your assets, up to date, firmware revisions and all that stuff, understanding the different devices that play in that world. There are a lot of companies that claim they can do it and just don't. So not only when was the last time you did an assessment, but who did it and what was their actual knowledge in the OT space, and what vendors have access to your system, what is their cybersecurity policy. A lot of times this is something that doesn't get thought of. We should trust, of course, it's the old trust but verify. You need to make sure that your contractors have a good cybersecurity policy, because it becomes a bit of a lowest common denominator issue, right? You're only as secure as your weakest link. And if you have vendors that aren't particularly on top of how they manage the remote access or how they work with you and how they handle cybersecurity themselves, they may not be in a position where they're designing networks or designing ITS equipment or systems in a way that protects properly for OT assets. So I'm just going to do a quick little overview of my team, what we do. We're a global cybersecurity services team. Originally started, as I think I hinted at earlier, in the lands of chemical and process, where the risks were extremely high to any kind of cybersecurity events. So we started in that world, but we have expanded considerably. We have 6, the large green dots are our regional hubs, and where we have labs, engineering testing, we do architecture replication, we do develop solutions for specific clients, do FAT testing and SAT testing. There are 17 district offices, so field engineering hubs, consulting facilities, 50 plus folks like myself, cybersecurity business consultants who have a lot of certifications, experience with industrial control systems over the years and how to secure them. And then the most importantly, we have 150 field service engineers who are highly expert on, you see all these different logos here that kind of represents some of the standards we were talking about and some of the certifications that our team has. Let me just quickly, so a quick overview. I know we're probably don't have we don't want to talk for, I do want us to move to sort of a Q&A format in maybe about 5 minutes. But these are the pillars. I think there's actually a few more depending on how you look at it. But the way we approach it is what, permit is the, what is the managing the access to operation systems information through network and physical controls. So what is permitted? We say, how do you do your authentication, your authorization? How do you do your accounting for what happens? And like I said, forensically, are you using things like multi-factor authentication? Have you properly segmented your network? Do you have a good secure remote access tool? What is the physical security? So that these are all in the land of permit. Protect is, well, what are you doing to protect those assets? What are the specific controls as part of your operational systems for ongoing protection? So that's things like, firewalls, endpoint protection, anti-malware, whitelisting, DLP, HIPS. These are all things that are more to do with philosophy, right? Whitelisting is the most basically only letting things. It's the opposite of a blacklist. You don't say, let things talk and then blacklist things as they cause problems. Whitelisting is the opposite. Only add devices that have been vetted. It's much more restrictive, but it's much more safe. What is your plan for, how do you protect for removable media, meaning USB drives? A lot of people know this. USB drives are famous for spreading worms. It's part of a lot of industrial control system problems, starting with Stuxnet, I think. A lot of them were, propagated this way. Protect, how do you do your patch management, as I mentioned? Detect, this is how are you monitoring your environment, to detect and communicate threats, right? And this is where we get into things, what we call a SIEM, Security Information and Event Management System. This is the console that basically brings in events and security information from a bunch of different systems you have. So you have one cohesive place to basically have your control operations. Look at what's happening on your network in many different layers. How is your network performing? What assets are, asset identification. So that's similar to that edge tool we talked about. There's a number of different tools that make sure that you're always aware of what is permitted on your network and what is talking. Finding anomalies when the network traffic gets weird or starts doing things that's out of a pattern, and how do you detect when an intrusion happens? And of course, respond is the part where what are your procedures? What's your disaster, your backup recovery plan? Again, as I mentioned, what kind of forensics can you provide after an incident? How can you respond as quickly as possible? So how do you contain and mitigate any cybersecurity attacks that happen to your location? And I won't go into this, but these are some of the services. I think we'll provide the slides. Anyone who wants it or anyone who wants to, you can pause the video if you're watching a recording. Basically, these are the types of services. We have a wide breadth and depth in our team. Worked on so many different types of sites and locations that we're usually able to find the right resource to apply to any of these. The ones in bold are ones that we are, known for, but basically everything on this list are things that we do. I won't go into a lot of depth there. And then same with this is sort of, if you overlaid that maturity model that we talked about, this is essentially the services that kind of go with that. How do you get to that point when you're looking at the deeper green on your right, on your far right? That's essentially when you get to that point where you're in what we called step 6 and 7, I believe, which are the more mature parts of your organization, where you actually have playbooks, you have attack path prediction, threat hunting, that kind of stuff. Like I said, you can pause and look at this, or if you want to have a deeper conversation about how we can help your organization working with Aviva Select, you just let us know. This is more of a success story. I don't think I need to talk about this. Just more that we've worked with companies with really large footprints and helped develop really advanced cybersecurity programs and postures so that they're much safer, much more secure, and more than anything, able to sleep at night, capable of understanding, okay, we are doing the right things to make sure that our organizational risks are covered and mitigatable. So, I mean, I think you can email. I personally, I don't know what that email is connected to. Probably either some of my manager or some other people. If you really want to get a direct answer, probably get my email from your Aviva Select contact, and they can try to see about setting up a meeting with us. But that's the core of what I have for you today. And now I will, I guess, we can speak about anything you want now. Any questions in particular anyone has for me?